This is the Anything Goes with Jackson Neill podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, here for episode number 125. Today, my guest is Matthew Chaim, discussing some of his latest music. Before we jump into that, though, I want to remind everyone that this podcast is available on all of your favorite platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud. So, make sure to rate and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform so you can get the new episodes that come out every single Tuesday and Thursday. So, Matt has a new project that's coming out in just about a week. The Mathematics of Nature. It's a pretty cool name. It comes out November 8th to be specific. The Mathematics of Nature is a cool project he's been working on for a little bit of time now. I talked with him about the inspiration behind it. Just, going into this, what was he thinking? What was inspiring him? And also just that name, because the Mathematics of Nature, it's something that really grabs me, that the first time I heard it, I just knew I had to ask him about it and see what exactly he thinks of that and how he decided on that name. I also talked to him about, being from Montreal, and now he's based out of Los Angeles, but also kind of splitting time between those two places. It was just a fun, all-around conversation I had with him. So, let's jump right into it. Your latest song you dropped was Reason. Can you just tell me a little bit about that track, like the inspiration behind it?
Yeah, so Reason came about at a time when I was sort of like, I was in a pretty long-term relationship before I moved out here, and that relationship ended as soon as I made the trek out to LA. So I'm from Montreal originally, and so in that time period, and what's ending up being a lot of the project that's coming out is a lot of songs about that relationship and the breakup. So kind of the trajectory of that relationship. And Reason was really a song that just I was inspired by the good things that came out of that relationship. And one of those things, while there was a myriad of them, one of those things was the strength that that person gave me and changed me in some very positive ways. And I tend to be like, I'm an outgoing guy, but I also have a very introspective and a part of me that definitely leans towards solitude and being on my own. And I could sometimes get deep into that side of me and deep into that hole and just kind of do my own thing. And that's definitely one of the strengths that leads to a lot of music creation, but it's also can sometimes be a drawback in that I sort of get lost in my own head. And sometimes when that does happen, I turn to, some vices of my own that sort of keep me in that space. Kind of like sometimes, weed, not that I think weed is bad, but in, periods like that, it can kind of be a crutch, or just getting lost on, the various little, I guess, quote unquote, mild addictions we all have in our lives. And it felt like that relationship and that person really kind of helped me get away from those things. And I saw the strength in what a relationship can do in terms of picking you out of those sort of, I guess, like dark rabbit holes you can kind of find yourself into. So that's really how Reason was born, was sort of, this person became the reason for me kind of letting go of those things and becoming a stronger person outright.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read about that, how you said, you're kind of like this outgoing person, yet you have these solitary moments. And I thought that was just a really interesting quote and a really interesting thing, because I think a lot of people kind of go through that, where they think, you're outgoing at times, but they always go through those stretches of being alone and kind of getting, like you said, lost in your own head.
Exactly. And it really is like a pendulum swing, like anything else, and I think it's healthy to go to find solitude and be able to sit with yourself and all that sort of stuff. But I think just like anything else, it requires balance. And I feel like we can often get caught, or at least I get caught in that world sometimes. And there's a ton of things that can keep you there. And, our society has been sure to make those super prevalent.
Yeah, exactly. I saw in a quote you mentioned like little things like TV and Instagram, and it's like amazing how those things can kind of suck you into yourself and make you waste time without spending it with other people.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I'm very interested and intrigued by the whole Instagram world we're in, which is obviously such an important app in our culture. And I see myself, when I get caught on it, and how it's, you could sort of, it's kind of like getting caught in your own thoughts, but instead you're caught in your phone and looking at everyone else. But, finally, sometimes, let's say I get lost for 15 minutes and pull myself away. It's like, wow, I don't feel good. Like there's a negative, there's some sort of darker energy that's happening here, but it's also so addictive. It's comforting. There's a comforting energy within that dark energy. And that's just interesting to me.
Yeah, I know that exact feeling when you pull away from your phone. You're like, wait a second, 25 minutes just went by. What am I doing? I don't feel that great. Well, just staring at a screen. I know that exact feeling you're talking about.
Yeah.
So you said there also that you mentioned like when you're in these kind of solitary moments, it's helpful for music creation. Do you find a lot of times when you're making your music, it's in the time of when that pendulum is swinging more to the solitary side, where you're more kind of in your head for a couple of days? Is that when most of your music gets made? Do you need to kind of have that solitary aspect?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in and of itself, it's also a pendulum swing for me. I don't write all the time. I tend to go on like, let's say a couple months stint of writing a lot and just going deeply. So I don't know if it requires so much solitary, but it's definitely a much more introspective period for me, where I do feel, I guess, less tethered to the world and external stuff, and more just like in my own thing. And I've always connected with producers who often I write on my own, like in terms of co-write. Like I don't do a lot of that. I just write on my own with a producer in the room. And I usually love it when the producer almost gives me that space to have still a sense of solitude within our session. That has always helped me. So yeah, I definitely think they're connected in that way.
Gotcha. And I find that interesting. So you go on these a couple months stints, you said, of writing your music. I guess when do you realize what usually sparks a couple months stint, and when do you kind of know, okay, this creative energy is kind of over? Like, is there a specific moment on either end that you can kind of define, like, oh, I'm going through this right now?
I read this amazing quote, and I'm going to completely mess it up, but it goes something like, you make art when the pain of making art isn't as great as the pain of not making art. Something like that. I definitely, that was a much more convoluted way of saying it, but I think it really resonates for me in the sense that at some point when I'm just on the pendulum side of not creating a lot, I reach a point where the pain of not creating surpasses the pain of creating and getting back into it. And that's when I start making again. And I definitely see that start coming up. There are many signs that start to tell me, oh, we're headed for a pendulum swing of writing a lot. And when I was younger and when I was, doing this and I hadn't been through that pendulum swing enough to know that it existed, those pains were much greater because they reached thoughts of like, oh, I'm never going to write a song again. I completely forgot how to do this. I can't believe I had the magic and now it's gone and all this stuff. But now I've started to come in tune with that's just the nature of how it goes for me. And, I'm like, oh, right now I'm in a period where I'm not writing a lot and that period will end. But still that pain does come of like, wow, I need to start writing again. But yeah, I see the signs and just like, I feel like I start hearing music a bit different. I start to get like just different, just kind of different physical responses to sounds and hearing like music that really touches me. I'm like, oh wow, I feel like I'm starting to get inspired in that way. And actually right now I do feel like I'm kind of on the cusp of beginning anew, because I've definitely been in a period where I haven't been writing a lot of music for the last just few months. And I feel myself starting to dip my toes back in, and I think soon I'm going to take a big plunge.
Well, that's good to hear. And it kind of reminds me of that almost a classic thing of people describe whenever they're working on their passion, that they'll say, they'll go, they'll be working on it, and then eventually they reach this point of almost like they get burnt out for a little bit and they take a break from it. And before you know it, they almost feel bad then because they're not working on their passion. So they go back to it. And it's like that constant cycle. Exactly. And yeah, I completely relate to that. There was one point where I drove from Montreal to LA in September of last year. So just about a year ago. And when I first got here, it was my first time
coming to LA where I actually had a lot of sessions booked. Because previous trips, I was sort of twiddling my thumbs. I only knew a few people. Not everyone's dying to work with me yet. And but when I got here in the fall, I had a full-time job. I had sessions every day, and I was writing every day, and it felt incredible. It was so invigorating and creatively satisfying. And then after like a month or two of that, I just started hitting a point where, wow, I sort of feel like I'm writing the exact same song every day.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had to get out of LA, and I went out, and that's when I really seeked solitude. was at that time when I just needed to like get out of the city, get to myself, and then came back refreshed. So yeah, that cycle is kind of a never-ending loop, but it's fun.
Yeah, exactly. It's what keeps life interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
totally.
You're from Montreal, like you've said, and now you're based out of LA, and you kind of split time, I guess, between the two, right? But right there, you said something that was kind of interesting. Like you almost needed to get out of the city in order to make some different music. Do you find yourself almost making different music depending on the location you're in?
100%. 100%. And I learned that in a big way 2 years ago, because I was at that point I'd never been to LA, and I was only really writing music in Montreal with a few producers I worked with there, and I didn't really know anything outside of that. And I also had a pretty stubborn mindset at that time. I was like, I'm not going to go to LA. I'm going to do everything from Montreal with my community here. But then I got very lucky to go on a songwriting camp in Nicaragua. That was a kind of destination camp put on by SOCAN, which is like the songwriters organization in Canada. And that sort of just blew my mind and really blew the whole kind of doors of music open for me, where, yeah, not only was the location so influential on the type of music we were making, but then also just like, being with all these different sorts of people from all these different sorts of places, a lot of Canadians, but not everyone was actually from Canada, and many people living in various places. But so yeah, the music that was made there was just completely different to me, and nothing I'd ever really touched before. And it showed me the possibilities. And now I see that whenever I change environments and change the people I'm working with, it's all the, context of what you're creating definitely influences the content.
Well, I've never even been to Montreal or Nicaragua, but I can imagine that there definitely is a lot of differences between those two places.
Yeah, in a big way, that's for sure.
So I want to get to this EP you have coming out, The Mathematics of Nature. I'm really intrigued by that name.
Yes.
Can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, I can. How that came to be was actually in drawing. It kind of happened in like kind of sequential events. When I was still in Montreal, I remember I was at a friend's house, and I think we were working on a video. It's actually a friend who is a director who actually directed the music video that I put out for my single Sunflowers. So I was at Leo's house in Montreal because he's also from there. And I don't know if we were in his room or his brother's room, but on the wall there was this cheat sheet, which is, I don't know if you had these growing up, but in high school we had these like cheat sheets where it's a funny name because it sounds like you're cheating, but you're actually allowed to have it in the exam, and they give you, you're allowed to bring one 8x11 piece of paper with as much mathematical information you want to cram on there into the exam and use it as a reference.
Oh yeah,
for the math exam. You know what I'm talking about? So I saw that on the wall, and I was just like, wow, that's really beautiful. Like it's very aesthetically pleasing to look at this like thing that this kid organized and highlighted and drew all these boxes. And I don't know, I really like busy stuff. Like I'm very inspired by Basquiat's artwork and just like really kind of busy, messy things. And I loved just the aesthetic of this cheat sheet. And then after that, I just found myself starting to draw a lot of cheat sheets. That didn't really make sense because I didn't remember the math I had learned in high school, but it was just sort of like, I was drawing a lot of math. And then this was around the time right before I did that trip across the country. And in that trip, what I was really inspired by was all the nature I was seeing, especially on the latter half of it when I went to Colorado, Utah, and these like stunning landscapes really just like imprinted on my memory, on my mind. And when I got to LA, I just found myself sketching and drawing a lot with crayons actually. And I just was always drawing math and I was always drawing nature. And so the two worlds kind of collided for me, and I came up with that title. So that's sort of how it was inspired. And to me, the meaning sort of it's just like an interesting intersect, math and nature. They tend to be like kind of opposed, where math is kind of very, I never remember the right and left brain, but one of them is right brain, one of them is left brain, very logical, analytical, thinking, a lot of thought. And then the other side is like nature, artistic, instinctual. And I kind of like bridging those two gaps. And I feel like creating music is sort of that, because you take kind of the kind of formless creation that just comes about and put it into music, which actually does have a lot of math involved in it at the end of the day. Whether we're talking about like the math of songwriting or just the math of music theory, it's very interesting how much it can actually be expressed in math. So yeah, I just found that like intersection of two worlds very interesting, and I'm still kind of discovering what it means to me as I, even create the artwork for the final project and all that. Like I'm still learning as I go what the title even means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are really two really cool things, I guess, to juxtapose against each other. And like you said, just this idea that I forget which one it is, but the left and the right brain, it's like almost it's two separate things, but you're able to kind of bridge the gap together. And it sounds really good. What it reminds me of is that I remember learning in high school. I don't remember this very well either, but like they say math shows up in nature a lot, whether it's how petals on a flower are like double from this flower to that, and it's something really funny that something we think of as just so natural and almost unkempt actually kind of has some math in it.
Yeah, and it's funny in the work towards putting out filming rather the Sunflowers music video. I wanted to sort of bake this whole idea into the world, so we were coming up with this idea of this like kind of like mathematician, science, kind of herbalist kind of guy who's really interested in flowers and studying them. And in doing so, the art director Ariel Vida for the music video brought up the Fibonacci Sequence, which was something I'd never heard of. But this is sort of this mathematical expression that actually pops up a lot in nature, in the pattern of flowers, in the way that like rabbit populations grow or something like that. And now I'm also going down that rabbit hole, excuse the pun. And when I was just in Montreal, I have an old friend of mine who I went to elementary school with, who actually became a math teacher and studied math throughout university. And we actually got together for coffee while I was in Montreal last week. And he basically just tutored me. Like if anyone was sitting next to us, they would think, oh, this guy is in school and he's in a math tutoring lesson right now. And he was teaching me about the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, and all these different things that do pop up in nature. So like I said, I'm just kind of like allowing myself to lean into this whole juxtaposition and learn about it, and see where it takes me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, the Fibonacci sequence, I remember hearing about that one in school too. Again, one of those things that I would have put on the sheet of paper because I would not have remembered it going into the test.
Yeah, exactly.
But I find that so interesting that math is inspiring you, because it's a thing we think of as just numbers and just equations, and not really something that could be taken and be inspirational, something kind of creative like music. I just find that really interesting that's serving as this inspiration for you.
Well, I think one of the ways I also look at it is like to me the whole math world and just the busyness of it, all this like kind of stream of consciousness, writing and busy stuff I'm doing, it sort of relates to kind of the thoughts, the busyness of thoughts that I always have, all this content going through my head at all times. And sitting down in a session or on my own, what have you, and creating music is kind of a way to almost transcend or get below those thoughts and touch on something more intrinsic and real that's coming from, perhaps my heart or just something deeper within me. And I sort of like that, it feels relative to that title too, because I feel like I'm kind of dipping below the math, dipping below the abstraction that goes through my head and goes through a lot of our minds. We're kind of stuck in our heads for a lot of our lives, and be able to just dip below that and touch upon something much truer like nature. And that's how a lot of the drawings I actually do, whether in session or just on my free time, end up looking like. I've been doing a lot of things where it looks as if the math is on the foreground, and in the background there's just this landscape of mountains or what have you. And that's what it sort of means to me, is like behind or below or above, however you want to look at it, exists this, natural intrinsic space that it just often gets covered by this layer of mucky thoughts. And that's part of why I even make music. The act of songwriting is something therapeutic to me, in that I think it brings me beyond those thoughts and into something much more true and real. And I like listening to that voice as much as I can.
These drawings you're making, do you always usually draw and like draw pictures around the time you're creating music, or is this something you knew that's been happening for this project?
This really just started after that trip, actually, when I got here about a year ago. The drawings. I think I drew a bunch when I was like a kid, but that sort of just went away naturally, I guess. And it was really, it just kind of exploded when I got to LA. And part of the reason I think why that happened, or why I started to really enjoy that practice in sessions especially, was because, like I said, it was the first time I was thrown into a lot of sessions. That meant working with a lot of different producers, some whom I hit it off with like crazy, and some who I didn't. And a lot of times those are first, they kind of feel like first dates, in that you're meeting this person for the first time. And not only do you have that whole social dynamic of meeting someone, but there's also the creative dynamic of like, okay, great, we just met each other, let's make something fantastic. And sometimes I felt like those certain sessions at least kind of get a little heady, and it goes more into those thoughts of like, how do we make something really good? And who would, where does this live genre-wise, and what have you? So I started enjoying, like, especially bringing crayons, because it's such kind of like a childish thing to just draw with crayons. And I don't say that negatively childish. I just mean factually, like a lot of children draw with crayons. And I thought it was kind of like a cool way for me to loosen that whole headiness of a session with just like drawing and kind of, making these little sketches that, especially at the time, because at the time I didn't know I'm going to be making my own album art with all these sketches. At the time, it was just like, I don't care at all the final product of these. I'm not trying to make something that's going to come out. I'm not trying to release anything here. I'm not trying to make money off this. I'm not trying to do anything with this except like let my mind be free and draw whatever I want. And I thought it was kind of like this interesting loosening tool to then let me drop into something a bit more creatively freeing when it came to actually writing the song. So it became this like really kind of interesting practice for me to do at the beginning of a session, to sort of just like, I guess settle into the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we were almost describing there, as it feels like, going into these sessions with these producers, there's almost this innate kind of like pressure. Like you said, we got to, in a session with you, we got to make great music. And I think of drawing and just coloring or anything like that, they always, it's always kind of said as like, it's almost like a therapeutic calming of the nerves. And that's a way you kind of found out to calm out the room and calm down before you ended up going into these sessions.
Exactly.
So this EP, do you have a release date yet, or a release time frame in mind?
Our release date plan is November 8th.
Okay. So November 8th, that's about a month from right now when we're talking. Just how do you feel going into that? How do you feel about a month heading into it and releasing this into the world?
I'm very excited with this music. I think so. The producer of the whole project is a producer by the name of Rabbit, who is actually now my roommate, and someone that we're talking of producers you connect with and those you don't. Like in that time period, once I got here in September, we had already written one song together previously on a previous trip that was actually Sunflowers, was the first song we ever wrote together. So we really hit it off. And then throughout the fall, we just developed a very strong collaborative relationship, and then also a strong friendship at that. And fast forward to April of this year, I moved in with him, and so he's actually like executive produced the whole project, and we've been developing this thing from a standpoint of a very freeing standpoint, honestly, of like, just being very experimental and creative and seeing where we can go. And we both, I think, nourish the other's creativity in our creative collaboration. So we're both very excited with the music we have to show. And also what's cool is like I put out 2 singles for it, Sunflowers and Reason, which I think bring you into that world that we've created, but it also just gives you, it still is very, I think, a small appetizer for what we've created as a whole. So I think there's like a lot to show in these songs. And then, yeah, also, I think there's kind of like, at least for me, this natural trajectory of between all the tracks. It's actually a 7-song project, so I don't know if that is legally an EP in this day and age. I don't know what you call it.
I'll count
but
it.
It's yeah, so it's a 7-track record or project or whatever, and yeah, it's something I'm very proud of. We're both very proud of, and I'm really excited. I'm really excited to share the whole thing with the world, and yeah, let people listen to the whole thing.
Well, a big thank you goes out to Matt for coming onto the podcast. Go down into the description on whatever platform you're listening on. There I'll have links so you can follow him on Instagram as well as listen to his music. Mathematics of Nature comes out November 8th. That's something I'm really, really looking forward to listening on that Friday. Well, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Anything Goes with Jackson Neill podcast. Thank you so much for listening to it. Remember to make sure to rate and subscribe to this podcast so you can get new episodes every single Tuesday and Thursday. For more episodes of this podcast, as well as my sports and music discussion ones, go over to jacksonneillpodcast.com. That's the spot where I publish everything I record, and there's archives of everything. Now, if you're a really big fan of the show, maybe consider becoming a subscriber over on Patreon. There, for just a couple dollars a month or even $1 a month, just $1 a month, you can get access to cool bonus content from all 3 of my podcasts, including bonus questions from most of my interviews here on Anything Goes, including some from Today with Matt, where he talks about his favorite music he's listening to, and a bunch of other fun stuff. I write, record, produce, do everything for these podcasts myself as a full-time college student, so any little bit of support just helps me spend more time making these cool episodes. If you want to stay up to date on everything I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at JacksonNeil20. Today's music is by Analog by Nature with their song CDK Sunday. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you all next time.